We begin ordinary time with this consideration of Jesus' first miracle. And he does his first miracle within the context of a wedding. The question is then, why? And what are the practical applications from this first miracle performed within the context of a wedding? A few weeks ago, we were at a birth. Last Sunday, we were at a baptism. This Sunday, we're at a wedding. What's happening? The key to this Sunday's gospel passage from the Gospel of John, in the second chapter of the Gospel of John, can be found in today's first reading from the prophet Isaiah. Keep in mind, remember, Isaiah is not a basketball player from Chicago, even though there's nothing wrong with basketball players from Chicago. Isaiah is a prophet of the Old Testament, one of a number of prophets, and the most important of them all. I suppose all of you have a Bible, yes, and that you read it, yes, and that you'll see in the Old Testament a whole slew of prophets. Of those prophets, the most important one is Isaiah. And in the Catholic Mass, right, we're all here, we're all wakey, then we hear from Isaiah a lot, all during Advent. Christmas Mass, prophet Isaiah, because Isaiah, in his prophecy from the Old Testament, long before Jesus was even born, is telling us that he's coming. So we listen a lot to Isaiah. And it's a beautiful book in the Old Testament. Highly recommend it. And in the 62nd chapter of the book of Isaiah, prophet Isaiah, which means it's a long book of the Bible, we hear these beautiful words that give us the key to understanding today's gospel passage. No more shall people call you forsaken, or your land desolate, but you shall be called my delight, and your land espoused. For the Lord delights in you, and makes your land his spouse. As a young man marries a virgin, your builder shall marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices in his bride, so shall your God rejoice in you. I think probably for most of us, we probably struggle with the fact that we think that God is somewhere up there on the planet Mars, a long way from us. Or we may also have the concept that God is not too far, but he's got this big axe and he's ready to chop our heads off for whatever we do wrong. The Bible tells us something differently. As we hear at the conclusion of today's first reading from the prophet Isaiah, and as a bridegroom rejoices in his bride, so shall your God rejoice in you. Do you have any kind of friendship or any kind of contact with women religious, commonly known as nuns? When they make their final vow, what do they have on their finger? A wedding ring. Why? Because it signifies their marriage to God. But that goes for all of us. Have you ever thought of God as being married to you? Have you ever thought of the fact that your relationship with God and God's relationship with you is a marriage? That's what the gospel is telling us today. That's how close God is to us and how we are to him. No matter what we do and don't do, God is always there. He's not distant. As a bridegroom rejoices in his bride, so shall your God rejoice in you. And for this reason, Jesus does his first very miracle within the context of a wedding, to show then that our relationship with God and God's relationship with us is nuptial. It's a wedding. That's the union that God has with us and us with God through the sacrament of baptism, which we considered last Sunday. So, the first thing that this is telling us, aside from the intimacy with God, that God is intimate with us, and that we have this intimacy with God through the sacrament of baptism, is that one of the things that today's gospel passage is telling us link then to the prophet Isaiah is that God creates us for joy. And God creates us for pleasure. And all the joys and all the pleasures of this world, like family life and good food and the intimate life between a man and a woman, and all the joys of life, like feeling good about getting things done with work and projects and education and creation and music and art, and all the things that we enjoy in this world are simply only a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, the heavenly wedding that we are moving towards. As we see, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, another Gospel, aside from John. And there we see the parables that Jesus tells, these stories, to explain and reveal divine truths. And Jesus, in these parables about the wedding feast, refers to eternal life in heaven as a wedding feast. So we are made for joy, and we are made for pleasure. We're not made for drudgery. Now, I'm not beating up on Baptists, but I just wanted to tell you a little parenthesis. Long time ago, many moons ago, in another universe, my first stint in Texas was in East Texas. And I came to hear stories about Baptist weddings where people don't drink and don't dance. I think people need to experience a real good Mexican wedding. And that's exactly the way life is supposed to be. I think Hispanics really understand the joy of life, where there's music, and there's food, and there's lots of laughter, and there's lots of wine. That's what Jesus is telling us in today's gospel passage. Now, at any wedding, there's always food, right? Now, the question is, another practical conclusion, is to ask ourselves, well, what is our diet? There are different diets that I've come up with. One I call the omelet diet. You know what the omelet diet is? The omelet diet is, just imagine I'm there at the door, I got this white coat on, like a chef's coat, chef's hat, and I got this latest nice gas stove, really good frying pan where I can prepare the best omelets you can think of. And after Mass, I'm standing there by the door, and the omelets are free. All you gotta do is stop, put your plate there in front of the frying pan, and I'll put the omelet right there on your plate. How many people would just walk by, not even noticing the smell of the delicious omelets? That's the omelet diet, where the joy of life, the intimacy of God, la cercanía de Dios, doesn't even register. And then there's the starvation diet. These are the people, not to judge anybody, but just looking at the way things are. The starvation diet is, get your sacraments. Get your tacos and your tamales. They're all free. Just get your sacrament. Get a baptism here. We got a special deal this weekend on First Communions. And then, like some of you are old enough to remember the famous magician Houdini, then poof, just disappears. And then, years later, fast forward the tape, and then, they want all the bells and smells for this marvelous funeral. Well, why would you want a Catholic funeral? You've been dead for 60 years already. Starving. Disconnected from God, disconnected from church, disconnected from life in general, because you're on the starvation diet, only focusing on the material, the physical, the rabbit foot, the whatever you want to call it. I don't get it, but that's the starvation diet. Then there's the garbage diet. I don't think anybody here is on the garbage diet, but the garbage diet is just the people that are into the world, into sinful pleasures, looking for happiness in all the wrong places. And we're all sinners, and we struggle with all these kinds of things, but we're here. And then the real diet that Jesus is talking about in today's gospel passage, connected to today's first reading, is really the diet of the mystic. Now, you hear the word mystic and you're thinking about people with beams of light coming out of their head, dead, or blood flowing from their hands, or all sorts of crazy things going on. And some of that stuff can all be legit and true, but that's extraordinary. People levitating, in prayer and all sorts of things, right? But that's extraordinary phenomena, and only a few participate in that. Like the stories of Padre Pio, and all sorts of people. And then, and we see this mystical phenomena in the world that's very interesting in the Catholic Church. Like if you read about the incorruptibles, okay? You know who they are? I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about the incorruptibles, who are saints, whose body doesn't, their body, though they're dead, they don't decay. There's lots of saints that are incorruptible. Their body's like as if they're sleeping. Well, that's a mystical phenomenon. Or like Lourdes. You ever been to Lourdes? And there's holy water coming out of the ground. And it's a healing water that heals people. Not everybody's healed, but some are. So that's all mystical phenomena, extraordinary phenomena, right? But what Jesus is telling us in today's gospel passage, connected to the first reading from Isaiah, is that we're all called to what's called the ordinary mysticism. It means that we can, as the psalmist says, we can taste and see the goodness of the Lord everywhere. We can see God everywhere. And despite our difficulties and our challenges, we experience the joy and the peace of being loved by God, who loves us unconditionally. As we hear elsewhere in the Gospel of John, the next chapter, God so loved the world that he gave us his only begotten Son, not to condemn us, but to save us. Jesus then calls everyone to the wedding feast. And a great saint who was once a great sinner, St. Augustine, famously said, "To fall in love with God is the greatest of all romances, to seek him the greatest adventure, to find him the greatest human achievement." Jesus, through the sacrament of baptism, calls all of us to the wedding feast. We have all received the invitation. What is your response?